So we're going to start. I am Professor Bonnie Friedman. I'm a creative nonfiction faculty member here at UNT, and I welcome you so much to this wonderful event where we're going to get to hear from James Marcus, who is an extraordinary, fun, charming individual. He's an amazing writer and editor, and I thought it would be very nice at UNT not only to have visitors who are writers, but also to get the perspective from inside the world of people who choose what to publish, to give us some insights about how that whole process works. So I'll just say a few words to let you know who James is, and then we are going to fulfill a fantasy of mine. I always loved James Lipton on Inside the Actors Studio interviewing people, so we brought the rug and the chairs, flowers, plant stand, so I get to have this peak experience of interviewing James in a way that would be most fun. So I think I will ask the first, 35 or 40 minutes of questions, and then think about what questions you have for James, because here you have access to somebody who's been an editor at a major magazine that is a big opportunity. Think about what you want to find out from him. This unique opportunity that you have. So I became aware of James's writing when I was reading his online reviews from Amazon many years ago. These gorgeous reviews. I was thinking, who is this great writer who seems to read everything and review everything? Little did I know he was employee number 55 at Amazon, and he has written a book about his experiences of working at Amazon when it was just this little .com. And recently, I don't know if any of you saw the Frontline about Amazon, Frontline PBS show. James was interviewed on that too, about his experiences working at Amazon when it was a very small company, and his experiences with Bezos. So he was an editor-in-chief at Harper's Magazine, and we'll talk about what Harper's is and what an editor-in-chief does and how one becomes an editor-in-chief. And he's published beautiful personal creative nonfiction essays in The New Yorker, The Virginia Quarterly, and other major journals. He's translated novels from the Italian, and he's now hard at work on a new volume of personal essays about Ralph Waldo Emerson. I just found out yesterday that he's in a novel reading group with my literary idol, Vivian Gornick. That's just like a typical James thing, like, oh yeah, she's in my reading group. Wow, okay. And I can't wait to talk to him and have a wonderful conversation in front of you all to illuminate us. And so everybody please welcome James Marcus. You want water.
I have all my liquids.
You have all your liquids. So
this is at every moment. Here we go.
James, fresh from New York. So I wanted to start off by saying, to ask you, how does someone end up the editor of a major literary journal? There's like the New Yorker, Atlantic, Harper's. These are like, I think of them as like the top three major, mass market journals. So talk to us about how you came to be there.
Sure.
It comes to mind.
I've asked myself that question many times, of course. Some of it is happenstance. Some of it is obviously the experience that you're bringing to it. I think I was talking to you earlier saying I think there are very few people who, when they're little children, say to themselves, I want to be a magazine editor when I grow up. It's very uncommon. And I certainly didn't feel that way, but I did feel that I wanted to be a writer. And I think in the population of writers, there is a subset of people who also have this talent for and love of editing, of doing many of the things you do as a writer, but doing it in collaboration with another writer whose work it is. And so I fit into that subset somehow. I wasn't so aware of it until I began working at Amazon, which was in 1996. That was a very peculiar workplace. It was certainly not a magazine, but there was a lot of writing and editing to do there. And I got to work with some very good writers there, and just found that I relished it, that I relished looking very closely at someone else's work, as closely as I would look at my own, and trying to make it better, which is to say, trying to make it sound like the most perfect version of the other person's work that you could ask for. So I did my time at Amazon. It was certainly a strange work environment that we could discuss a little more. And then that was in Seattle. I moved back to New York in 2001, and shortly thereafter began working for America Online, another non-traditional publishing environment, and also the Columbia Journalism Review, which is kind of a watchdog magazine for the journalism industry. But that was really, I got to really sink my teeth into working with wonderful writers, some people I had idolized for a long time, who I could reach out to and say, would you write a piece for us? And then, quite wonderfully and almost miraculously, in 2010, Harper's approached me and hired me as deputy editor, which felt absolutely like a lottery win to me. I had read that magazine since I was in college, on and off, and while it shares certain characteristics with, as you said, the New Yorker or the Atlantic, as a national magazine about culture and ideas, it is also an eccentric magazine with its very much in its own lane, and its sensibility was perfect for me. So I did feel at that point like I had won. I had gotten the perfect job for me, and I was there for the next 8 years.
So I think that's just so interesting for people to think, as they think about their own careers, a smaller thing, another thing, and then somebody noticed you and invited you in, and then you worked your way up from deputy editor to editor-in-chief, right? So could you tell us, what does an editor-in-chief do? What is the...
I suppose that varies from one magazine to another, and probably I may have been a less than ideal editor-in-chief in the sense that I really loved working with writers, very closely, and I was reluctant to let go of that when I became the editor-in-chief, and often because you're supposed to be overseeing the whole publication now, and in a way being a big picture person and not lost in the microscopic brambles of someone's prose. You're not supposed to edit that much stuff anymore. But I had a sorry addiction of my own, and so I continued to edit a lot of the writers I worked with. And some of them, as I matured, I let go of them and, remanded them to other editors to work with. But, that's a very big difference between all the other levels of editorship and being the editor-in-chief. Even as a deputy editor, when I was the number 2 person, I didn't have to be the big conceptualizer for Harper's Magazine. I didn't have to try to balance out the contents of every issue, and I certainly didn't have to deal with being a manager, dealing with people's raises and who wanted a more comfortable chair and things like that. I could really concentrate on bringing in pieces. When I became the editor, if you're going to do the job well, you have to let go of that. And you have to be thinking about the package that is every issue of the magazine, and that chore is renewed every month. There's always another one. Just when you're dropping from exhaustion, it's like it's time to start over.
And so you'd have this is just an aside, just sort of like an overall concept of what is going to be in this issue of the magazine, like how different pieces were going to speak to each other?
Yeah, exactly. Now Harper's doesn't do thematically organized issues. Many magazines do. But you wanted certain, sometimes explicit or subterranean connections between pieces, and you also wanted a balance in the magazine, because the thing is, Harper's in particular, sometimes there'd be issues that were there'd be 5 dystopian articles in a row. There's a lot of terrible things in the world, and they all deserve to be written about, but not all in one issue of every magazine.
Okay, right.
So I think an editor is responsible for bringing some lightness and humor and just some entertainment. That's part of what we want from a magazine experience. Now, Harper's usually is working 2 months ahead. It's a bit of a slow mover. So that pretty much absolves you from doing news coverage, which is kind of a gift, because we're awash in news coverage and 24/7 news. So to be able to work at a magazine whose role was to have deeper, and not slower thinking, but certainly deeper thinking, was great. And we would usually have some idea, maybe looking 5 months down the road, like this would be the cover, this would be the fiction, and then we'd usually have 4 or 5 feature well pieces to put in there. But as in any, enterprise like that, things fall through, circumstances change at the last minute. So often the final 2 weeks before ship would be, if things went smoothly, it'd be pretty much okay. But there were some very sudden changes of course I mean, I'll just give you one example. In November of 2016, we were working on the January issue. And I think that we assumed that Hillary Clinton was going to win the election. And I thought that maybe by January of that year, we could have a non-politics cover, right? Because there'd just been a fire hose of politics coverage throughout all of 2016. So I had commissioned this great piece by a writer named Austin Smith, he's a poet and a fiction writer and a nonfiction writer. And it was about the Green Bay Packers. He had grown up on a Midwestern dairy farm, and there was the Green Bay Packers were like cult figures throughout his childhood, but he had never gone to a game in his whole life. So we got tickets for him and his Midwestern dairy farmer dad to go to this game, and he wrote a wonderful piece, so we got great photos. And that was what was scheduled as we got into early November for the January issue, which, to complicate matters further, would be on newsstands in mid-December. But when Trump won, we couldn't put the Packers on the cover of the magazine anymore. You know, it would be essentially the next issue we were doing. So, and we didn't have a lot of time. So I wrote a piece about the election, which I did very quickly. I mean, it was 4,000 or 5,000 word piece, but I did that very quickly. We had a front of the book column by Rebecca Solnit, who's a regular contributor, and that was actually about Confederate monuments. But we kind of tilted it a little bit so it would at least allude to the election. And then our publisher, I guess in a dream, a vision came to him of Trump behind bars, so he insisted we do a cover like that.
Trump yelling what?
Behind bars.
Oh,
yeah.
Fantasy.
So, I mean, he kind of came in the morning and said, I've had a dream vision. You know, we must, and of course when the publisher, who's the owner in this case, says that, it's like, all right, you know, we'll commission that right away. So that was really like in the space of a few days. We had to drastically change that issue. But most of the time, it's a bit calmer than that. But still, though, there are pieces that either are not finished on time, that you schedule, pieces that simply turn out not to be good enough, that you end up killing, or something that is timely that you suddenly feel must shoulder its way in ahead of the other thing. So it's definitely a juggling act, and some of that is logistics, like what you have. But some of it, again, is making a magazine experience that it is a balance of humor and catastrophe, and short and long, and light and dark. And that's certainly a big part of the editor-in-chief's job. I mean, that's your privilege in that position to say, this is the bundle I want to tie together for February or whatever.
Thank you. Great. So, I'm going to back it up a little bit, talking about your education.
Mm-hmm.
I know that you studied with Annie Dillard, who is one of our great creative nonfiction writers. And in my graduate class last semester, we were reading an essay by Alexander Chee about studying with Annie Dillard, and you were saying how you still, there are certain things about what she taught you about being a writer that stay with you today, and I'm wondering if you could remember any of them, like what helped you in your training as a writer.
Yeah, they weren't so much like stylistic tips or rules. In fact, some of her rules, we were talking about before, were, to me, interestingly peculiar as an undergraduate. One was like, don't ever buy a house. Because she felt like that would just drain every penny and bit of energy you had out of your subsequent life. Another one was take speed. I think like diet pills was her deal. But I mean, what has stuck with me is that
would she write on them?
I think so. Yes, I didn't learn.
Heroin?
I didn't get all the details, but I think it involved composing while taking Dietac or some pills that are not even manufactured anymore. But No. The thing that really stuck with me was the absolute passion she brought to being a writer, and the sense that you could make sense of the world. You could make sense of the universe. It was a metaphysical task. It wasn't, how do I understand current events? In fact, she tended to overshoot current events, but she wanted to use the tools of a writer to understand what made the universe tick. And those are very lofty goals, and maybe when you're an undergraduate, it feels like that's biting off more than you can chew. But to have that implanted in you, it was pretty great. To not have little ambitions as a writer, to not think that you are kind of the court juggler or an entertainer, but that you could penetrate to the heart of things in your best work.
Yeah, that's what comes across in the Alexander Chee piece too. That the sense of that she wanted her, even though they were undergraduate writing students, to have just full ambition for themselves as writers, to make their contribution as writers, and take
No,
themselves seriously.
that's very inspiring. I mean, when I was getting my MFA, Joseph Brodsky was one of my teachers, and we had to write some little papers. It was a poetry. I wasn't a poet; I was a fiction writer, but I took a poetry seminar with him, and you had to write these, sort of short papers. And his admonishment was like, write this as though you'll be run over by a bus tomorrow, and this will be your last will and testament. And that's heavy. That's heavy for your paper that you're writing for class. But that's how seriously he took it. And it was a compliment, in a way, to extend that to the students. And it stuck with me as well. Those were both great teachers. People I still think about them as teachers, quite a few years after I studied with them. So.
And tell us, what was your major when you were at college?
Studio art.
Is it studio?
My parents just tore their hair out, I'm sure. But that's what I wanted to do. I was always interested in writing and always interested in text. And even the art I made, which mostly they were large prints, they often had text in them as well. But I was, taking English courses. I was studying with Annie, and by the time I graduated, it was very clear that I wanted to be in the language business and not in the art. I love visual art, but I don't do it myself anymore.
Yeah, I think that's very good for people to realize that the thing that you major in isn't necessarily where you're going to. I was a third world politics major. I was telling you.
Yeah, I hardly know anybody who's actually really stuck with a major.
Right. Yeah. It's really interesting. So one thing that I know we want to be talking about is what is it in, say, an essay is submitted to you. What is it that makes you really want to publish something versus something else that's very well written but doesn't make you feel like I need to publish this? Help talk about the sort of things that signal to you like, yes, this might be worth committing pages in the magazine to.
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's a stream of stuff coming in all the time. I mean, in a magazine like Harper's, there are submissions from writers themselves. There's submissions from their agents. There are submissions from friends of friends of friends. I mean, it's sort of coming at you from all directions, and there's a lot of winnowing. I would say the two things that are the most important. One of them, obviously, is simply like the tone of voice, whether it's in a pitch or whether you've received a piece of fiction even. But I'm talking more about nonfiction here at the moment. Even if it's a pitch, you want like the very distinct impress of a personality in there. And it's not, it's about style, but I don't mean style in terms of prettiness or choosing the right adverbs. Style and voice indicate a way of looking at the world. It's a whole concept. And you want to be grabbed by it. You want to be struck by it. The other thing is that if someone is pitching an idea, which is happening all the time, an idea for an essay or a piece of reporting, there really has to be something counterintuitive in it somehow. And by that, I don't mean like a simple gimmick turning upside down of some. I mean, that's very easy. That's like a parlor game. But there has to be something surprising in there that goes against your own sense of how the world works or the consensus of how the world works, because otherwise there's no friction in there. And what you don't really need someone to eloquently just tell you something you already know. I mean, obviously we have all read pieces like that are just very beautifully stated versions of things we know, but that is not the most exciting kind of writing. I mean, the most exciting kind of writing is challenging what you know. And in some way, rearranging your mental furniture, even in some subtle way, so that you emerge transformed in perhaps the minorest way from reading it. So that has to be there. And you can sense it when it is. And sometimes the writer hasn't yet sensed what that thing is. But those two things are very important. And they sound rather abstract, but I think on an instinct level, you definitely know them when you stumble across them.
Could you give us some examples of some, because we were talking earlier about Harper's published, I think you were saying, like the second piece that Leslie Jameson, who is an enormously successful creative nonfiction writer,
her book was on the bestseller list for when it came out with Grey Wolf, which is amazing for a book of essays, her first book of essays.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just wondering, like, what was it about her writing that made you feel like that this was the piece about, for those who've read the empathy exams about Morgellons?
Morgellons disease, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, in that case, it was already the essay she had written. She wasn't pitching it; she was giving us the actual essay. She has a very distinctive voice. She's known, empathy is her bag, baby. But I mean, that's simplifying. I think she has this intense curiosity about opening yourself up to other people, and then to what extent should you believe them? To what extent is it unkind to not believe them? And this Morgellons piece sort of locked right into all of her concerns, because Morgellons disease is like a disputed disorder where the people who have it certainly believe they're very sick. But the medical community, mainstream medical community has not officially said it's a real illness. And the symptoms of the disease are quite strange, including, sort of worms are crawling out of my forehead, and there's all sorts of strange skin stuff going on. So she went to a convention or a meeting of these people because in the internet age, you can actually have a community of people who are suffering from something when they call it Morgellons. So she went and spent some time there, and it's a real tightrope walk in a piece like that, because on some level, I feel that she doesn't totally believe that this disease is real. But she totally can see that these people are suffering tremendously from something, right? There's something going on there. And in the end, it doesn't matter so crucially whether it is a physiological disorder or a kind of spiritual or mental disorder or something that might even overlap. So it was fascinating. And she was not going there as a kind of forensic person to say, hey, it's not real. These people are all deluded. She absolutely did not believe that that was her job. And that was just right for that piece. And I mean, she did another piece for us, which was about, there's a sort of think tank or institute at the University of Virginia which investigates past life experiences that people have had, and particularly children who feel like they can recall in fragmentary form their previous lives as adults. And she sort of immersed herself in that world, and in a way it was the same thing. She visited the family, one family where a kid had very detailed memories of having been on a destroyer in World War II. And sort of inexplicably detailed memories about what had happened. It was a real ship. I mean, he remembered real details. And she was really wrestling with the same thing in the end of like, but do I actually believe this? And we had to press her a little bit, because I think in the end she found it a fascinating human dilemma, but like she didn't really believe it. And we had to push her, because I think she was almost more comfortable in this, gray zone of belief, non-belief. Not because she's a lazy thinker, but like she loves to explore that area.
Could you explain, like, why is it a stronger essay if you push her? What do you mean?
Well, I mean, there's all sort of different reasons you might push somebody. I mean, if you feel that there's something weak in the essay, something that undermines the argument they're trying to make, or a lot of it just has to do with you can feel the energy dropping off in a piece of writing, whether it's fiction or nonfiction. I think you can't always explain why, but I think an attentive reader can feel like the sort of engagement and the voltage is going down. So sometimes it's just a matter of like, take that out. That doesn't work. Or sometimes it's contradicting your argument. Not so much in the Morgellons piece, but in this piece we felt like it was important for her to convey to the reader that she was skeptical in a way. She wasn't skeptical while she was hanging around with this family, but as a writer, with more of a bird's eye view of this, like she didn't completely accept it.
Because the reason I bring that up is I think it's easier as a writer, especially from academic work, to say, well, I want to present an even-handed approach. I don't want to pass judgment, especially as a younger writer. I think but I think it's useful to hear that from an editor's point of view, that isn't sufficient. That the editor wants, not just the equanimity and the detachment, but more of a feeling of a greater investment that will,
Yeah. I mean, you want writers to be, particularly nonfiction writers, to be scrupulously fair to other human beings. But that's not the same as having no opinion about the topic of your essay. So that's what we were kind of pushing her on a little bit there. And that's just part of the job. And sometimes people don't want to do it.
Right. And what happens then? What would you do?
Well, then there's a lot of variation. It depends. There are some writers who are, they're eminent. They've written for Harper's for a long time. They've achieved a kind of old master status.
Like who? Like maybe some.
Well, I'll give you an example because I had just a weird going back and forth with her. I edited a piece of fiction by Cynthia Ozick. She's just an amazing writer. She's in her 80s. And in particular, if you accept a work of fiction in that situation, you're not going to tear it apart and rewrite it. It's either, you're a great famous writer. We'll essentially take this as is, but we might have some minor improvements, or you're going to turn it down. Whereas if it's someone who's starting out, you might say like, oh, there's a germ of an amazing story here, and let's work together on it. And that happens a lot also.
And that's good. We want to hear about that.
Yeah, that happens a lot. But with Cynthia Ozick, she wasn't presenting this to be rewritten, and my comments were really quite minor. Sometimes they were literally, could we start a new paragraph here, or could we put a comma in here? And I realized, because she was in her 80s at this point, I realized that I was inflicting tremendous pain on her by doing this. She was deeply upset about it, and she would send me back long memos explaining why every single thing should be as it was. And I have to say, more eloquently argued than many pieces in Harper's Magazine. And the funny thing there was, like, she didn't realize that she actually held the whip hand in most ways. Like, we were going to give way unless we thought there was something terrible in the story, but then we would have said that. So I eventually just wrote her and said, look, I'm really sorry. Like, it's been a privilege to go over your work. I felt like I was in a sort of one-man submersible looking at the ocean floor. But I said, well, unless it's factually incorrect, we'll really let you do what you want here. On the other hand, there are writers where, again, you see the germ of something beautiful, or it's just too long, or they haven't quite gotten over the final summit there in terms of the story working. And that's one of the great pleasures of being an editor, is working on multiple drafts of a story.
It's really interesting, because some of the people in this room are probably fiction writers. And so I've never understood that much about how, the process by which, a story gets accepted for publication. I think you said that Harper's published 12 stories.
Well, 12, yeah. We have one in every issue. And there are more than one editor. There's not a fiction editor. There are several editors who work on fiction, so you're unlikely to do more than, 3 or 4 in a given year. You did want to choose carefully, and just a limited number of slots.
And what would make you feel like, okay, this, because obviously you were inundated with excellent material from agents and, people just submitting.
Yeah.
What would make, is there a thing you could tell us about that would make you feel like, okay, this is really worth my running?
I'm just trying to think. I mean, look, I was lucky enough to work with just amazing fiction writers. I did a story with Laurie Moore. I did one with Cynthia Ozick, Michelle Huneman, a writer I really love. T.C. Boyle, someone who's written for Harper's many, many times, so I did 2 stories at least with him. But it was a thrill to come across writers who were new to me at the beginning of their careers. Leslie Arima, who's a writer, I thought was quite amazing. We did a story of hers. A young writer named Akhil Kumar Sami, who is of Sri Lankan descent, and FSG did a book of hers called Half Gods. But I think we were the first magazine, a national magazine, to do one of her stories. I think in her case, though, and this is a frequent problem, the story was too long, and there was, in a way, too much framing material around it. And so I just felt for a short story we needed to stick more to one central narrative and remove some of the outer material. And she was amenable to doing that. And often if someone is going to do a book, you can say to them, well, you can put all that back in your book. And often they do. So that kind of lets everybody win. Other ones, I'm just trying to think. I think most of the short fiction I did was in reasonably good shape.
Was it mostly agented? Did it come from, or do you
a lot of the fiction was agented when I think of it. There may have been 1 or 2 that sort of, someone I knew pointed the person in my direction. It was more common with nonfiction to not. There were many, many agented nonfiction pieces, but the percentage of ones that came in non-agented was probably higher in other areas. Maybe just because there's only 12 stories a year. So the competition is so intense And Harper's is lucky to have long relationships also with John Edgar Wideman or Joyce Carol Oates, people who are really productive, and their stuff is always going to keep coming in. And I will say for someone like T.C. Boyle, who's also insanely productive as a writer, I would turn down a lot of his stories because I knew they would just keep coming, and I could wait until the right one was there. And I guess he was used to it. Like, he was never offended by it. I did feel initially like, oh my God, I mean, look at this guy, I'm turning down his work. But same thing with Joyce Carol Oates. I didn't edit her work, but, there's kind of a Victorian level of production there, and you could wait for the one you really liked. You didn't have to take. But all I'm saying is there were a limited number of slots for people that you maybe had never heard of. So
I think it's interesting to for people to hear and for me to hear that even these authors who we deeply admire are getting rejected. They're just
Oh, I'm
constantly.
still cringing over some, Richard Powers, a writer I love. I turned down a short story of his, John Barth. I mean, people who were like heroes of my, younger days as a writer. But, and obviously I would be really polite to these people and sincerely sorry not to be running the work, but there just weren't that many slots. If you did not feel it was good enough, then you had to say, like, please send us more. Oh, Deborah Eisenberg, I passed on one of her stories. She's one of my heroes. So I felt like a beast, really.
Mm-hmm. Did you ever see something that you turned down, published someplace else?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
I mean, I suspect that a lot of writers who, are publishing short fiction, like, many of them try the New Yorker first because it has special prestige and because they do 50 a year. And then I think often they would come to Harper's next. Then I don't know what order they all did this in, but I'm sure they would try the Paris Review, they would try Harper's. The Atlantic doesn't do fiction anymore regularly, I don't think. But so yeah, I would definitely see things that we passed on, and many things we passed on were really good. It's just that when you had so few slots for that work, you wanted to hold out for like the best possible piece you could get.
Does Harper's publish poetry as well?
That's a funny question, actually. Harper's has a section called Readings, which is basically like a second serial. So there would be poetry in there.
So that means reprint.
Like from the book that just came out.
Oh,
we might do a little poem in there. But then the last 2 years I was there was an initiative, not mine, to publish long poems, which are not customarily published in other like national magazines. So 4 times a year we would do either a long poem or sometimes a sort of constellation of shorter poems that might be thematically related. Ben Lerner is the poetry editor, so he would select them and he would write a short introduction. And I usually edited those introductions, but that didn't require a lot of editing. So at the moment, I think there is still this 4 times a year thing, but there have been long stretches where there was no poetry in the magazine. I think they just felt like we do a lot, we couldn't do everything.
Right, of course. So he would choose which poems he wanted to, like he's probably getting books that were about to be published, and he would think, who do I want to introduce to the readers?
No, that was his. We did like a Long Ocean Bong poem and a bunch of other things. And it was lovely to have them in the magazine.
Yeah.
On at least one occasion, the publisher wanted to publish a certain poet and played his publisher's card.
Right, that's really great.
And, we published that. So, but normally it was Ben Lerner who was choosing it. And I guess that's still going on there.
That's great. Let me ask you about your own life. Well, 2 questions. One is pitching. So sometimes you would be buying essays on the basis of seeing the finished essay,
right.
but then sometimes some writer would just say, "I have this idea."
A lot of times, yeah.
A lot of times,
yeah.
I have this idea. How long would a pitch be? What would excite you? And our students don't know much about this aspect. We're dealing mostly with finished product, but
yeah.
It's very interesting to hear how an editor works with a writer to make the thing come along. So it's not only, I think we often think, oh my God, I've got to get it all together before I submit it, rather than this other, seeking buy-in from the publisher.
Yeah. Well, Harper's has a pretty long tradition. First of all, there's a very strong tradition of essays in Harper's. It's a classic venue for American essayists. But it also has a long tradition of the reported essay. which is, kind of a hybrid creature where there's strong essayistic elements, maybe possibly ruminative elements, but there's reporting. Someone goes out into the great world and, puts the stuff together. I mean, Leslie Jameson is a great example of that because, when she, whether it's the Morgellons thing or the past life, she's simply not going out there the way a newspaper reporter is. She's going out getting great material, but that becomes grist for the mill of meditation. So there's a lot of that. And of course, the balance between those two things, and it's a very porous boundary, right, between a reported piece and an essay. And that was another thing I loved about Harper's, that they encouraged that kind of work. For people who are pitching a sort of a reported essay, let's say, I think often, you could make the sale with really 1,500 words that are very well argued. You could sell a piece to Harper's, maybe even less than that. You need just a few really persuasive paragraphs, which both have to be putting across your idea and why it is worth commissioning 5,000 words about it, but also the quality of your writing really has to be in there. And I think that that's a mistake that is made sometimes. There's an assumption that this is just a business letter. This is a pitch letter. This is not a sample of my writing. So it can be rather business-like, but that's not true. The pitch letter is your calling card as a stylist, and I'm not saying you should overdo it. It shouldn't be like a sample of purple prose, because that's extremely off-putting, but your personality should be in there. What you sound like should be in there. And that's enough of a nugget to get you through. I mean, in a way, that people who write a perfect pitch, it's what a fantastic pleasure. It makes your day as an editor. Now, it's possible, and it happens sometimes, that the person writes that piece and it doesn't work. It was a great pitch, but it didn't turn into a great piece. And
talk to us about that. Where you've seen that happen.
I mean, it's endemic to magazines. Well, to magazines that are commissioning a piece from you. I mean, if you write a piece of fiction, it's they're probably going to take it or not, or someone's going to say, "I'll work with you on it." I suppose you could work on it, and it could not pan out, but. Particularly on pitches, there are pieces that move sideways and don't turn out to be what you thought they were going to be. There are pieces that are exactly what the person said, but they just turn out to not be good. Or the person dives into the reporting and the material's not there. I mean, there's a lot of ways that it could go wrong. Now, sometimes the person just writes a different piece, and that piece turns out to be delightful as well.
Yeah, you were talking.
I was talking with Bonnie earlier today that Nicholson Baker, a writer I love, I was lucky enough to work with. He pitched at one point, he wanted to write a piece about the cloistered world of mathematicians. High-end mathematicians who cannot communicate with other people about their work except the other 7 high-end mathematicians in their area. So that seemed like a perfect match for this guy's work. And he went to MIT. He lived in Maine, but he came down. He went to MIT, spent some time around those people, filling up the whiteboard with really long equations. We waited for the piece to come in. And then he called me, somewhat sheepishly and said, I don't want to do that piece anymore. I want to write a piece about how terrible Algebra 2 is for American high school students. Total change of, it's math, but it's a total change of pace. And he had already started doing the reporting. He talked to a lot of math teachers and to a lot of unhappy students. And I just said, okay, do that one. It still sounded like a great idea, and he's a great writer. We put it on the cover. It was absolutely fun. But sometimes when people jump the rails, it's just there's a car crash or whatever, and it just doesn't work. And I hate telling a writer that their piece didn't work out. Often they've put a lot of time and energy, and also for many of them, it's hey, I'm breaking into the big leagues here, and it's absolutely crushing sometimes to be the editor and to tell them that it's not going to happen. And it's worse to be the writer, but it's very hard to be the editor. Sometimes you can say to them, you can really write. You're right for this magazine. Come up with another idea. Let's do another. And there's, frequently a happy ending there too, because if you thought the person was suited enough.
Sorry.
Wait, does that mean something?
Yes, that means that we're going to ask the audience to give questions. That was my timer, so that I didn't take up all the time myself.
Okay.
That's I just wanted to say that I think it's very wonderful to be reminded at every level of writing that even very established writers flame out, they don't deliver, they take a turn, or pieces that seem very promising, so that, there's success and failure all along the way, and it's just a normal part of the life of being a writer, that some ideas are going to pan out. You think, oh my God, this is going to be so great, and when you're writing it up, not so much.
Absolutely. And also, I also see those pieces appear in other magazines. So sometimes it's a matter of they thought it was great and perfect elsewhere. I just wanted to say one thing very briefly before we open the floor to questions, which is that I wanted to banish one misconception about Harper's or magazines like Harper's, be it the New Yorker, the Atlantic. I know, because I'm a writer also, so I've been sitting in the same position all of you are in, and that these places can seem really impenetrable. They seem like citadels of accomplishment that you can't possibly get into. And it is true that the bar is really high at these places, but the dark secret of these magazines is that they are desperate for new writers at all times. I mean, even magazines that are lucky to have a deep bench of great writers who are regular contributors, which is true of Harper's, the lifeblood of magazines is new writers. And you simply cannot have a national magazine where all of the contributors are 65 years old. Because, even if I'm not an ageist, I love 65-year-olds. But you start to lose touch with what is most current in the culture. There's a certain kind of cultural news young writers bring that a writer a generation later will not do. And it's also just that you need new talent in a magazine. So it's something to keep in mind, that they're not admitting it, but they're really desperately seeking new writers at all times. And also for editors, the big feather in their cap is they discovered a new writer. So that is secretly operating on your side. And so when you're feeling down about the genuine difficulties of this whole enterprise, just remember, there's an editor waiting for a new writer, on the other side of the email chain, and just keep it in mind. So just wanted to make sure I said that.
That's great. Thank you. So I hope that you have questions for James. What questions do you have?
Nothing is too trivial.
So before getting the call from Harper's and right after you graduated, was there a moment of confirmation that you were this is what I'm supposed to be doing? There were probably multiple moments like that. Some of them for me came from people I was studying with. Their confidence in me meant the world when I was just starting out and really didn't know what I was doing. Obviously, the first time you see your name in print, and actually, I broke into print doing a lot of book reviewing. Which is still actually a great way to break into print, but there were many more print venues to break into print into at that time. So, I began writing pieces for the Village Voice, the Philadelphia Inquirer, the Nation, and the New York Times Book Review eventually. And that was a great way to kind of cut your teeth because there was a great demand for that kind of work, and it didn't pay that well. But I will say that seeing my name in print the first few times was a huge confirmation that I could exist in that magical seeming world of print that other people had been in and I'd been just a consumer of. So yeah, between that and affirmation from teachers, I guess those were very big things.
Thank you. There was another question. Thank you.
What kind of techniques and skills do you probably see in successful fiction writers?
Techniques and skills for successful fiction writers?
In successful fiction writers.
Well, certainly skills including great management of sentence-to-sentence prose. And that doesn't mean fancy, that doesn't mean Mandarin or, a simple style is very hard to manage too. But I think just very basic changes in the tempo of the piece, changes in texture, which I think is a great thing just to keep readers on their toes. That there may be one narrative moving forward, but the texture of the experience keeps changing. Obviously, in a piece that makes use of it, adroit management of point of view is always very refreshing and effective. And then underneath all that, it's not a tool or a technique, but it's you want to have feeling in it. Technique by itself is never enough. And strong feeling and some technique
is usually better than lots of technique and no feeling. So, but I mean, feeling isn't a switch you can turn on or off. It just has to do with your relationship to what you're writing about, and that it means something important to you. So I don't know if that's a good answer, but sure, go ahead in the front.
Oh, thank you. What would you say is the biggest difference between being a writer and being an editor?
I actually do have an answer for that. I was thinking about it earlier today. I think being a really good editor involves a very peculiar combination of having a strong ego and being egoless, because it's your taste and it's your judgment and your ear that you are bringing into the situation. And you have to rely on them, because sometimes you're proposing to overrule the writer and saying, like, I have a better grasp on this than you do. But at the same time, all of that is in the service of the writer. And you're supposed to be, in the end, essentially visible. Like, everything you do is making that writer be more herself or more himself. So it's a weird thing to insert yourself and subtract yourself at the same time. And I think it doesn't work for a lot of personalities. And again, there are a lot of brilliant writers who I think probably cannot be editors for that reason. So I guess that's the difference.
Other questions? Yeah.
Yeah, I think speaking a bit to that, from the inserting yourself and also being invisible, I know you've also worked as a translator for quite some time. I'm wondering if there's anything about the process of translating that informed the way that you worked as an editor, or vice versa, and sort of the balance.
Yeah, no, those two things are very, very connected, and I'm glad you brought it up. It's the same thing. Like, when you translate a book, you are looking at the language like more carefully than anyone else beside the writer and the writer's editor will probably ever do. And again, it's a myth to say, well, it should be transparent, right? You should just be a pane of glass, and the writer's work is visible on the other side. But that's not how it works. I mean, you are writing that text in English, and it's very imbued with your own personality, and yet oddly, you're supposed to be out of the way at the same time. I will say that, I worked with writers who are living and writers who are dead. Stick to the dead ones. That is way easier. I worked in particular with this one writer, Oriana Fallaci, which was just a total nightmare. And so I went back to dead people. The next one was Casanova. He was dead for 200 years, so I knew he wouldn't complain. But those two processes are very much connected, absolutely.
Other questions? Oh, yeah.
What are some of the biggest changes or most important changes in publishing during your experience?
In magazine publishing in particular, or just publishing altogether? Well, okay, let me answer on behalf of magazine publishing. Magazines have been under tremendous economic stress, for, let's say, 20 years, Obviously, they're under pressure from the internet. They're under pressure from changing demographic and reading trends and all sorts of things. There are magnificent magazines being published, but it's much harder to make them a viable economic vehicle now. Harper's is a nonprofit, right? So it loses $4 million a year, and its owner makes up the deficit. The New Yorker claims to be profitable, but it's part of Condé Nast. It's part of a big profitable magazine conglomerate, like magazines like Vogue, which are many times more profitable. So they can afford to break even or even lose money. So that's just a challenge for every magazine right now. But it would be a great shame if magazines went away, because that combination I was talking about before of comedy and tragedy and deep reporting and personal essays, that's the only kind. That's what a magazine is. And in a way, the web has taken that all apart, so you can self-curate it and draw find this thing and find this thing and that thing. But the idea of a beautifully curated package is what a magazine is. As for book publishing, it's been under some of the same pressures, obviously, from digital reading and so forth. But I feel like, in a way, the plague of ebooks that were going to destroy the ink and paper book, it has been so oversold, and we all kind of recognize that by now, that the book, which is itself an amazing piece of technology, is not in any way about to be wiped out by the Kindle, and I'm happy about that. But there are economic stresses for all of these publishing arms, and everyone's kind of tiptoeing through it.
So maybe two more questions. That would be it. I saw some other hands up. Questions for James? Yeah.
Back there?
Can you talk more about how you can identify and maybe modify pieces of texture?
How to modify its texture.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, there's simple enough things like either you can have a piece of fiction or nonfiction that alternates two different voices, two different characters. You can have a toggle between a first-person narrator and a third-person narrator. But in certain kinds of fiction, you can simply insert what seem to be chunks of nonfiction, that are sort of commercially generated. I mean, that's a very modernist thing. It's a very Joycean thing to do, to put in passages of prose that seem not to be from a work of fiction, but from some, the world of commerce or the bureaucraties or something. But it even comes down to like alternating sentence length and paragraph length and alternating long sections of exposition with scenes, with narrative scenes. Like, there's an incredibly big toolbox if you want to use it all as a fiction writer. And some people don't want to use it all, but it's definitely all there. There's a lot of sort of magical instrumentation to make use of.
Last question. Who has a question for James?
How do you, when you're editing, how do you tell when a piece needs too much work and to reject it, or when a piece needs just enough to where you're willing to work on it?
I mean, well, you read it. I mean, you're reading it as a reader as well as an editor, and it's part of it's like, gee, how much do I like this? I guess so. It's like there's 50 variables at all times. There are definitely pieces that show up massively too long. I mean, there's one. I worked on one piece with the writer William T. Ballman, who was also one of the Victorian producers of text in our era, and he contributed to Harper's for a long time. And his absolutely regular procedure was to, the piece that we assigned, that I worked in, had to do with oil workers, most of them immigrant oil workers in the United Arab Emirates, and he went there to talk to these people, and he did his usual technique of submitting 25,000 words so that we could take 6 out of it. But his attitude was to take whatever you like. I mean, he wasn't a diva. He knew that because he's going to put all 25 into his book, which would be 1,000 pages long. There are a lot of writers for whom you would simply say no. That's part of your job. You quarry it out of there. But exceptions are always made, and especially for someone as amazing and eccentric a writer as he is. So it's like each case is a unique case. I mean, I would not advise people starting out. If you get a 5,000 word assignment, you should not send in 25,000 words. It won't make you look good. But I mean, it could be a little long. But you should try to respect the deadline. You should try to respect the length. And if you really felt like, oh my God, there's another 5,000 words here, talk to your editor and say, here, this is not what we agreed on, but what would you think? But do not send in 25,000 words. I'm just urging you not to do that.
Well, that's really, so a few things before we thank James for this amazing afternoon, this amazing access, extraordinary access to somebody. I mean, I wanted James to come here so I could meet him. I'd heard about him for years. And we, just to get this, I mean, it's so valuable to get the editor's perspective. There's nothing like it. And to hear an editor speak, it's different from reading about what the editor has to say. I mean, I just feel like it's invaluably, fabulously wonderful that we had James. And I loved sitting in this chair and pretending that I was, a lot of the Actors Studio type interview. James is going to read this evening. He is an amazing essayist, an amazing creative nonfiction writer, beautiful stylist. And so I invite you all. That's at 8 o'clock at where?
Sage Hall 116.
Sage Hall 116. So let's thank James. I hope you enjoyed this afternoon.
Thank you all.